to see all of you and to welcome you here. And we are in a series on Chassidus, as you know, and it's a sort of, I don't know how you describe it. It's a preliminary series to delving deeper and deeper, right? So we are looking at a lot of background material, and we are thinking about ideas that are important in terms of thinking about Chassidus, thinking about the way that this major, primary, first important early modern Jewish revival reform movement thinks in terms of theology, in terms of how it thinks, how it lives, sociology. And this is a 4-part class, as you know, live from Poughkeepsie, New York, and in honor of Cliff and Sarah Cornell. Hello, hello. And we have partners ranging from San Diego to Needham, Massachusetts, from Seattle to Gramercy Park, New York City. So it's great to see so many people here, and as usual, it's a tribute to the absolute wonderfulness of CSP and its programming. If you go to csp.org, you will see the programming not only for this week but for the month, and really kind of amazing stuff that goes on, and you should definitely support CSP. I'm sorry, it's occsp.net. Right? There's a YouTube channel, there's a podcast, you can register, you can join, you can support us. To sort of recap, we've been talking about Chassidus as a religious revivalist movement, Central and East Europe, beginning at in the 18th century. Sort of the protagonists, are contemporaneous with people like Benjamin Franklin, who was very long-lived, and George Washington, right? Today I'll be talking about the Chose, the seer of Lublin, who was contemporary roughly with George Washington. It's a kind of interesting idea to think about, that these people were flourishing in the Jewish community while the revolution was happening in America, and the one in France as well. We talked in our first session about law and mysticism, and the ways in which they sometimes seem inimical, but in fact, those who practiced mystical, those who engage in mystical practices throughout Jewish history have by and large been people who were not only lived their lives in the dictates of law, but were expert lawyers, were halakhic experts. We discussed how that could possibly be. Last time we talked about sectarianism and denominationalism, and what the different sort of geographical, chronological, and eventually ideological strata of Judaisms were, and where Hasidus fit in that larger picture. And today I want to talk about leadership models. Basically starting with the question, what's the difference between a rabbi and a rebbe? And I'd like to both talk about this, put it in context historically, and illustrate it with some stories of tzaddikim, that is pious or holy persons, and the rebbes, charismatic leaders, who are often synonymous. Beginning with the Bible, there are a lot of absolutely fabulous and interesting models for leadership. And I would, if we're gonna begin by talking about the Bible and the way leadership models develop or proceed from there, certainly the first leadership model we can think of is God in the Bible. Now, it sounds strange to compare God to human leaders and Jewish leaders, but in fact, because of the principle of imitatio Dei, that is the imitation of God, which holds for every person, right? So the rabbinic midrash says, Ma hu rachum af ata rachum, just as divinity is merciful, so you are meant to be merciful. So in a positive, in a chiyuvi way, positive way, l'shevach, in praise, The God model is a good one. The idea that God is loving and fair, and that God's relationship to God's creations is one of mercy. In fact, God is called, an important epithet of God is rahum, which is related to rechem, womb. So if we say, we generally translate that God is merciful, we might even more properly say that God behaves toward creation with womb love, with the love of someone for something that's been created inside of one and has come out into independent being. And that's a very important model. On the other hand, and this I think is interesting as well, you know, I'm teaching a course on Jesus and the Gospels next semester at Vassar, and I often talk about God as depicted in the Hebrew Bible versus God as depicted in Christian scriptures, as God in Christian scriptures is God as one would desire God to be, right? You know, because Jesus is, besides cursing a fig tree on one occasion, and on another occasion denying that his mom and his sisters are more important than his students. You know, he says, "You're all my family," right? In general, and on another occasion saying, I've not come to bring peace but the sword. Okay, these are little glitches, but in general, Jesus is Jesus who becomes in Christian theology divine, right? Is generally a model of divinity that is, you would say, more felicitous, more sweet, more open, more loving, right? Than what Christians have sometimes in history characterized as the wrathful deity of the Old Testament. And so the way I like to make the contrast is that the Christian Bible describes God as we would wish God to be, and the Jewish Bible describes God as we might think God is just from looking at the world, right? Plagues and natural disasters, and not to mention the consequences of free will, right? But that's okay. You know, it's very interesting to observe God as a leadership character in the Hebrew Bible, because obviously whatever God is as a character in the Bible, God, if there is a God, right, beyond us, beyond the world, beyond words, beyond description, beyond scripture, is one thing. And the way the Torah discusses and describes God, Torah dibra bilshon b'nei Adam, right? The Torah speaks in human language, right? And so God gets frustrated. God's nose gets red. God gets so angry, vayichar af Hashem, right? That God's nose gets heated up, right? In anger, right? Or God extends a hand to punish or a hand to save. The character God in the Bible is a problematic leadership paradigm. One would hope for the justice and mercy that appends to God in many descriptions of God in the Hebrew Bible. But when one looks at the overall picture, right, God is like, I don't like this world. They're all corrupt. I'm gonna smash this world and take my toys and go home. You know, or God says to Moses, right, these people, they're fetching all the time. You know, I should wipe them out and start all over again with you. So when you look at God in a leadership, the character called God, in a leadership capacity in the Hebrew Bible, one of the things that becomes very clear is that God is very human, which makes sense because it was human beings who wrote the Bible, and they wrote this character called God, and they created God in their own image. And God, of course, in the text turns around and returns the favor by creating human beings in God's image. But there is an interconnection of images there. And when we look at the downsides, let's say, of the divine leadership personality, we're really seeing a reflection of all those things, ego and petulance and frustration that we can see in human leaders. So in the Hebrew Bible, God, I would say, is a mirror, right? Not a projection of what we would desire God to be. God is a mirror of us. And then if you think of the other models as they unfold in the Hebrew Bible, they're very interesting. Abraham as the first kind of progenitor with Sarah of the Israelite people, more accurately the Hebrews, because Abraham was called the Ivri, in the Bible seems to be oscillates between two character traits, right? One is quiescent, complacent, quietistic. That is, whatever God tells him to do, he does. And the other is argumentative, right? A thorn, so to speak, in the side of God, standing up for justice. It's interesting to see where Abraham, as a leader, stands up for justice. That is, when it comes to people he doesn't know, right? He exhibits, you would say that if Abraham was the president of a country, he would exhibit extreme, care and concern about a nation of people that he doesn't know individually, right? But is his home life messed up, right? So Abraham fails repeatedly at home in a variety of ways, favoritism and not seeing clearly, right? It's almost as if in two aspects of Abraham's life, when Abraham is dealing with God and Abraham is dealing with strangers, Abraham is an exemplary leadership model, but it all collapses at home. I don't know if you're this kind of person. I'm very organized in certain aspects of my life, but that is at a cost because other aspects of my life are utterly, falling into desuetude, right? And complete disorganization. So that in that aspect, Abraham is also a very human leader. And his connection with God is quite interesting. He meditates, right? So it says, Abraham is sitting in the heat of the day by the entrance to his tent, and he raises up his eyes and he sees three dusty travelers in front of him. In other words, he's somewhere inside of himself and the reality of the present situation, these people sort of appearing before him, takes him out of his meditation, right? And then he actually says to God at that moment, God, hang out a bit, don't go away from me, right? Just stick here in the back of my consciousness. And then he says, Yukachda me'at mayim, let water be brought, a little water be brought, and we wash the feet of these dusty people. So Abraham is sort of oscillating between a shamanic trance connection with God and a very sort of real connection with these people he thinks they're people he sees before him, right? Little does he know that it says Vayera alav Hashem, right? God appeared to him. So these three people are also God. They're an immanent aspect of God rather than the transcendent aspect of God to whom Abraham relates in his meditations. And then at the end it says Abraham went back to his makom, to his place. And some rabbis interpreted that as Abraham goes back to his conversation with the makom, the omnipresent. So Abraham's really good at connecting in a shamanic way with the divine. His first vision involves dividing the carcasses of animals and then having a vision of a torch that flows through them and a wind. And, he's engaging in this shamanic action. And he's also good when he sees people in front of him at treating them, strangers though they may be to him, as aspects of divinity. But he's bad at dealing with his own family, right? He's bad at dealing with his own family. And again, you have in the case of God as leader and Abraham as leader, right? Two models that have good aspects and bad aspects. By the way, I skipped one that I think is very important, which is Adam and Chava, sort of Adam and Eve, and their leadership role. So in the Quran, Adam is called Khalifat Allah, right? The Khalif of Allah. And if you know Hebrew and Arabic, the word Khalif means to exchange, the Hachlif, to change, right? That which is in place of. And that comes, of course, from the Hebrew Bible, where Adam as first human, and Eve, they're given two commandments. One is to conquer the earth and subdue it, right? Which is the colonialist, imperialist model. And the other is that they're put into the garden to guard and to tend it. So you have conquer and subdue and guard and tend. And like everything in the Hebrew Bible, these two are poles that interact with each other. Human beings throughout their history have applied both of these models, going out and discovering new lands, conquering them in the name of whoever, planting a flag, giving everybody who was there already diseases and killing them, and then claiming the land as your own, for better or worse, right? Is the imperial model, right? Rule over the earth and subdue it. And the other model, to guard and to tend, is the model of shepherds and farmers and environmentalists and people who are working together with other people and in concert with the good interests, best interests of the land, right? And both are represented there as leadership models. So, okay, so God, Adam and Eve, Abraham and Sarah. Now, there is an aspect of Abraham that is not often remarked upon, in that Abraham was a warlord, right? Abraham was a person who found in God's command to him to populate a particular land, found, as one does, that the land was already populated by other people. And as a result, he undertakes military campaigns, sides with certain people against other people, right? So that's a model in Judaism. It's not a model that was often in effect until the rise of the state of Israel, a sovereign state with the sovereign army, right? So from biblical times and early rabbinic times through the rise of the state of Israel, there was no Jewish army, right? But that model still appends, and occasionally in history, for instance, the caliphates in Spain, when during the Golden Age, people like Shmuel ibn Agrela were also generals in the armies of the caliphs. That was a model that they looked back upon. So we can add warlord and eventually general, which I will get to. It's a little bit different than warlord. Warlord is a sort of leader of skirmishes, right? A guerrilla battler, a strategist on an on-the-ground level, not from the on-the-top level, right? General is something that's sort of a higher rank, so to speak. All right. And then we have tribal leaders. These are sometimes called judges in the Bible, right? I would think of them as clan leaders, that is, leaders of particular families, and this will be important. All of this will be important for Chassidus, but this is particularly important for Chassidus. Leaders in the Bible of particular families, or even of the entire nation, but in which one's family origin is very important, right? So, there was a man from the tribe of Dan, right, who becomes one of the judges. I believe it's Shimshon, who is the judge from the tribe of Dan, though I may be incorrect. Ahuva, am I right? Is it Shimshon? Okay. So, it's important to tell us that he's from the tribe of Dan, because the Danites, it's all lost to us. We have a small hint of this in the totemic blessings with which Jacob and later Moses blesses the tribes. So, Dan is described as a snake that bites at the heel of a horse and brings down the warrior, sort of a guerrilla tactic kind of idea. And of course, Shimshon, Samson, behaves that way with the Philistines or the Philistines. Depends on, whether you say Bernstein or Bernstein. I think I told you that when my mother was throwing my father out of the house, she was alleged to have yelled at him, Leonard Bernstein was Bernstein once. So there was obviously a difference in opinion of how, with regard to how they pronounce the family name. Epstein, what's the difference? So the Philistines were attacked by Samson, who was the snake, right? The guerrilla warrior, right? today we'd call him a terrorist, right? Because from the perspective of the dominant culture, Philistine culture, right, he was the terrorist. He was undermining by underhanded means, not by frontal warfare, the state structures and frightening people and doing stuff like that. So yes, so the tribal leaders were tribal. They had the character of each of their tribes. And that's very important because in the Hasidic world, eventually, as you very well know, or you could know just by listening to the names of Hasidic groups, Lubavitch from a town in Russia, Satmar from a town in it's now in Hungary, let's say, okay? Babov, another town in Poland, right? Kalev, another town in Hungary. These groups came from specific places in Central and Eastern Europe. And let me tell you something. When you look at Hasidim today in Muncie or Mea Shearim or Bnei Brak, and you see this sort of insular, surrounded life that by and large they've created for themselves. Of course, everything is constantly changing. And Hasidim, as all Haredim, as all ultra-Orthodox, are involved in the political life of the state of Israel. And of course, in politics in America and New York State. They are a political force, but generally, culturally, they sort of try to hermetically seal themselves. And you may think of that as, their old-fashionedness, right? But it's not. It's a product of the American Protestant ideal of the city on the hill. That is that pristine Puritan city that's closed off from the realms of the sinners. In Central and Eastern Europe in the last century, Hasidim, although they had particular adherences to particular charismatic leaders, were on the street and in the street with everybody else. Zionists and non-Zionists and anti-Zionists and people who thought speaking Hebrew was the best thing in the world and people who thought speaking Hebrew was a desecration of the divine name, and a great variety of people all in one place without walls, I would say semi-permeable membranes, to take a metaphor from biology, right? And so Hasidim are in the mix. And that means that a Chassid from Kalev, or a Chassid from Lubavitch, or a Chassid from Satmar, or a Chassid from Babov is taking something of the environment in which they are and bringing it into their Chassidus. This is very hard to distill because it is a world that has disappeared. So we don't know exactly that the fact that this custom or this way of this expression, right, was actually something that came from the wider environment. Now, this ceased after the Shoah, after the Holocaust. If we ever, probably in the third series on Chassidus, which maybe we'll do one day, we'll talk about why Chassidus has become so insular, what precipitated that, okay? But I just want you to know that there is something of Kalev in the Kalever Hasidim's way of being, and there's something of Lubavitch in the Lubavitcher Hasidim's way of being. One of the ways in which you see this is actually music, right? Because music was, and we'll talk about this at hopefully another session on Hasidic music. Music was something that was taken from the wider society, and there, Take, we can find some evidence of what was in particular areas of Poland, or what is now Ukraine, or what is now White Russia, right? So you have that. So tribal leadership and the tribalness of Hasidus. Then we have Levites and priests. These are special tribes. The Levites, a tribe in general, the tribe of Levi, was elevated to the service of God, meaning that they did not have land, they could not farm or shepherd. It was their job to protect and tend a particular garden, and that garden was the Beis Hamikdash, was the temple, and the temple religious ethos or culture. And in order to survive, they received tithes. They received gifts from the people. So it's hard to imagine, because Rabbinic Judaism so transformed, created and transformed Israelite religion into Judaism, right? It's very hard for us to imagine that the average person living in the land of Israel while the temple stood was a farmer or a tradesperson or did whatever he or she did whatever they did. And their religious life, although I'm sure they talked to God and prayed in whatever way they prayed, was not primarily an organized Sabbath Torah reading in synagogue. Synagogue was just developing then, kind of life. It was 3 times a year, and at other occasions when it was necessary, bringing a sacrifice or delegating somebody to bring a sacrifice to the temple in Jerusalem. And those sacrifices, the best part of the sacrifice went to the priests and the Levites in order to sustain them physically. That's what they ate, right? And the other parts were burnt for God, who apparently has a nose and enjoys the smell of barbecue, right? The sweet savor goes up to God. And so the Levites and the priests are 2 classes of people whose leadership consists of service, whose leadership consists of service. Now, they are also the preservers of the most conservative strata of Jewish culture, of Jewish religious culture, because it is to them that certain sacrifices are owed. Those sacrifices have certain configurations, they have to be presented at certain times, etc., etc. And that's okay. That, as we discussed in the first class, is the law aspect, the halakha, the life ways, the going, the daily Weltanschauung of what it means to be Jewish in that period, but what Israelite religion meant. But there's another aspect, perhaps corresponding to the mystical pole rather than to the legal pole. If we could say that the priests and the Levites were servant leaders devoted to the preservation of tradition, right? And the written Torah and its strictures and its demands, then there were other people consistently throughout the biblical period who were very much involved in getting transmission, so to speak, directly from divinity. And these are prophets. Now, it's very important to understand, as we move forward to thinking about Chassidus, what the prophetic model is. Because the servant preservationist traditionalist model will be obvious to us in Hasidism, right? The Hasidim themselves and the rebbe are preserving traditions, passing them on dynastically. The rebbe, for instance, as the charismatic leader, is supported by trumot, by contributions, by tithes, just as the priests and the Levites. But there's another aspect of leadership while the temple yet stood that eventually transforms and is adopted in Hasidus, and that is prophetic leadership. It's very important to move away from the idea of a prophet as articulated generally in our society, someone predicting the future. The future will be, right? Rather, a prophet is an exhorter in the Hebrew Bible. So a prophet will say, if you listen to me and love each other as God, right? Always speaking in the name of God. Listen to me and love each other, then everything will be good for you. But, and the lion will lie down with the lamb, etc., right? But if you disobey, terror and fire and brimstone, right? These aren't predictions of the future. They're rather admonitions to good behavior. Now, prophets occasionally do say things that are visions of a better or more just future. And it is certainly true that the aspect of prophecy that has to do with intuitive or foreknowledge is present in Hasidism. And we'll talk about that in a second. And so that aspect, right, getting your message directly from God and preserving tradition, priests and prophets, very important as a model. Okay, then generals, right? Deborah, famous general, She was also a tribal leader, a judge, right, a shofetet, but she was also a co-general with Barak, who was a general, a strategist, right? And Deborah was also a prophet. Deborah was an all-around person, right? She was prophet, she was general, and she was a judge, right? She was a tribal leader, and she used her intuition to help guide Barak, who was more of, less divinely inspired and more of a talented general on the ground, to make strategic decisions. Then we have kings and queens. This is a position that is a position of reluctant leadership in the Bible. You will recall that the way the Israelites get their line of kings and queens is by fetching to God in the book of Samuel, right? That they want a king like all the other nations. God does not think this is a good idea. God is like, hey, I'm the king of you. Why would you want anybody else, right? This is the petulant, jealous, egotistical God, right, speaking. And yet God makes this concession because God sees that the pride of the Israelites and their desire for normativity, right? Herzl famously said, we will have a Jewish state when we have Jewish whores and Jewish cops to arrest them, right? Now, that's, that could happen anyway, and it's not the most felicitous example, right? But the idea is that, both the criminals and the law enforcement should be ours. And, the Israelites really wanted something that was theirs. They wanted to have a system like all the other nations. And the process of having kings and queens in Israel is highly, highly problematic. It always, it involves many strictures, right? That the king should not multiply horses, and the king should not multiply wives, and the king should not put people in boats and send them back to Egypt, from whence God said they would never go back, right? So all the things that kings in other nations tended to do, that is amass massive military for their own pleasure and elevation, amass sexual partners, impose their will on the people against their will, was forbidden. And this made Israelite sovereignty a very interesting, problematic, and difficult situation. But it is the leadership role that's stuck. And here's why. When I was a kid, I went to yeshiva through 6th grade. And then my parents got divorced, and they couldn't afford to send me to yeshiva, so they sent me to a big, scary public school, okay? Which really was, a very difficult adjustment to me. And my whole life, after leaving yeshiva, I had gaguim, like, how would you say it? Desires, like nostalgic desires for my yeshiva, right? Now, my kids went to yeshiva. They went through 12 grades of yeshiva. They have no nostalgia for yeshiva. They don't care if they'd ever see a yeshiva again, you see? But because I was taken out of it, I have a certain kind of nostalgia for it. So with all the problematics of sovereignty of kings and queens, when the Romans ended Jewish sovereignty in their occupation of Eretz Israel, and they ended Jewish sovereignty and destroyed the temple and exiled the people, the model of sovereignty under a king or queen was the last position, let's say, that Jewish political thought held, okay? And at that, as the last position, it held for them a great deal of nostalgia. And so the model for the future was that one day we'll have sovereignty back and we will have a king or a queen again. And that glorious, make Eretz Israel great again, right? That glorious era of what once was will be returned to us. Now, who's a king or queen? What does it mean? Well, whoever this person was, and this person was always appointed with the help of a prophet and with God's ordination, all of that. When the person was appointed, they shone a big spotlight on the person, Like the person comes out to make a declaration that they're going to run for president, and all the cameras are flashing, and the spotlight is upon the person. Well, in antiquity, they didn't have spotlights, you see. So they took oil, the purest olive oil that they could, golden in color, and poured it over the person, right? And that person was like covered with a layer of gold, right? Just like a spotlight was shining on them, and they were anointed Mashiach, right? Anointed of God, because a priest would anoint, or a prophet would anoint the king, right? Or the queen, right? And so the ideal of the anointed, or the Mashiach, which had been put to bed by the Romans, put to rest by the Romans, was a future desideratum for Jews because there was a nostalgia attached to it. So we have this character called the Messiah, who's a kind of leadership paradigm who is now outside history. Because when the Mashiach shows up, whoever he or she is, the Gemara says very explicitly that Queen Esther could have been the Messiah. It's just that the moment was not right at that moment. So when the Messiah shows up, it will signal the end of history as we know it, that is, with Jews in subjugation and not having sovereignty, or if they have sovereignty, an incomplete and problematic sovereignty that's disputed by among themselves and by others, right? When Jews have complete sovereignty in their own land with a clear leadership that everybody can agree on, right? It sounds, well, messianic, right? Then history as it is presently configured will have come to an end and will be in a new era. So this figure of Messiah never was a supernatural figure, a figure who is God in some way, or even a figure who is divine. This is a political leader who all Jews can agree upon, who will bring all Jews back to the Holy Land, rebuild the temple, and institute through Jewish sovereignty an era of peace and harmony in the world. Just the idea that two Jews could agree on one leader is so problematic that the Messiah is often in the realm of fairy tale, but is very much present, and it's present in Chassidus because the idea that the rebbe might be the harbinger of the Messiah, by example, that the charismatic leader might be bringing us in that direction, or might even themselves be that person, is always sort of present in the back of the Hasidic mind. It jumps to the fore in certain Chassiduses, particularly today in Chabad Chassidus, where the idea that, that a man who's dead and buried in Queens is the Mashiach and will rise from the dead and maybe participates with God in divinity, but one should not say that because it will put off other Jews who can contribute financially to the cause, is a unique configuration of right now contemporary Hasidus grappling with this idea of a Messiah, a dead Messiah, comparisons with Christianity, all of that. That's for another talk. But Messiah, Mashiach, is a leadership paradigm. So after kings, queens, messiahs, priests, prophets, right? Not to mention tribal leaders, shamans, warlords, and generals, we have paradigms that exist in our world as it is constituted. That is what I would call late Judaism, right? Judaism of the 21st century. If you look around your community, you'll see all kinds of leadership models, from cantors and teachers to people who plan and engage in the promulgation of adult education. I would argue that Ari Katz is the best leadership model of a Jew that I know. I don't know anybody who does more for Yiddishkeit. I'm serious. He's not paying, well, he is paying me, but I mean, he's not paying me to say this, right? Than Ari Katz. If he could get a Covenant Award, I'd give it to him. The deadline is today. So so it's educators, right? And people who promulgate education, and rabbis and teachers, right? Cantors, right? People who are in congregational service, right? How does that relate to the idea of a rebbe? And what is the difference between a rabbi and a rebbe? Okay. So what does it mean to be a rabbi? A rabbi has to learn a certain corpus of textual material nowadays. A rabbi has to assimilate certain knowledges about life cycles, about problems and dilemmas that come up in the natural life of a Jewish individual and a Jewish community. And a rabbi has to have a certain degree of pastoral kind of care. Certain Somebody must mute their dog, please. Thanks, Eileen. I appreciate it. A rabbi must have some sensitivity to a congregation. Okay. Now there are different kinds of rabbis. There are rabbis whose primary mode of operation is to teach, and there are rabbis whose primary mode of operation is to preach. There are rabbis who stand up in synagogue and give sermons every Shabbos and holiday. And there are rabbis like my wife, who's a poseket halacha. She has Orthodox rabbinic ordination. But what she does is she writes chuvas to shilas. She answers questions, primary questions from women about personal issues involving marriage and divorce and various things that affect their lives. And tries to bring to bear the corpus of Jewish texts on them. She never wants to lead prayers in synagogue or get up and give sermons. That's not her thing. So there are a lot of ways to be rabbis, and the different denominations handle the idea of being rabbi differently. But one thing is true. We don't expect our rabbis to be priests or prophets or shamans. We don't expect them to have direct divine guidance. I mean, some people do, there are always people who kind of idolize the rabbi, and that's lovely in a way, the idea that somebody who's very learned should have our attention and should have our respect is one thing. But the difference between the rabbi and the rebbe really could be encapsulated in the idea of charisma and direct contact with God in a way on the part of Rebbes. So I want to tell you I could tell you a million stories about Hasidic Rebbes, but it just occurred to me this morning, and I guess the only time in which prophecy comes down into the world in my house is Sherry, you have to ask Ari Katz about the question you asked. Sorry, the only place that prophecy comes down in my house is when I'm taking a shower in the morning. Occasionally, I'll come up with an idea that came out of nowhere, seemingly. So today, I was thinking of Jakob Yitzchak of Lublin, who is known as the seer of Lublin in Poland. He was born in 1745, died 1819, rough contemporary of George Washington, actually. So you think of George Washington in his three-cornered hat and wig, and you think of Yaakov Yitzchak of Lublin in his big fuzzy hat, and his wife had the wig. Okay, so that's the guy, and he was a very interesting person who had a lot of charisma. I was just going to say this. Thank you, Bernard. Bernard says, I was just going to say this, that Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, of blessed memory, said that a rebbe could talk to an audience of 10,000 people, or maybe said 1,000, with such fire that everybody thinks he's speaking to him. And a rabbi can speak to an audience of 1,000 with such penetrating moral force that everybody thinks that he's speaking to the person sitting next to him. That's very cute, right? Cute assessment. All right. So here we go. Yaakov Yitzchak of Lublin. So I'll tell you, you get a story and a half for the price of a story. Pay your dues to CSP because you're getting a lot for your money. So it's told of the seer of Lublin that every day he used to come home from shul, sit down at the table, clap his hands and say, right, which means, God, open up your holy hand, right, your hand, and satisfy every living being according to its needs. And at that moment, the door to the kitchen would open, and in would come his servant, his non-Jewish servant, his Gentile servant, and put his breakfast on the table right in front of him. And it was a custom every day for him to do it. Well, the servant saw this shtick going on every day. And one day he said, it's not true. It's not true. It's a lie. The Rebbe thinks his food comes from God. I'll show the Rebbe. I am going to withhold his food tomorrow when he says that Hebrew phrase. Good. Next day, the Rebbe comes home from shul, sits down at the table and says, right? And the servant doesn't do anything. Sits on his hands behind the door, but he's watching. After a minute, there's a knock on the door. The door opens. A man comes in. He brings a gigantic tray full of food, much more than breakfast. There's food there for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and every bris that you could imagine. He puts it down in front of the Rebbe, and he hugs the Rebbe tightly. The Rebbe hugs him, and he walks out of the house. The servant comes out from behind the door, says, "What is this? Rebbe, you know what happened today?" The Rebbe says, "Yes, I know. You didn't bring the food." The servant said, "What? What? The Choseh of Lublin says, "Look, about a year ago, I was in shul in the morning, and a man came up to me after davening and very timidly said, 'Look, my wife and myself, we're childless, can't have a kid. And I know that your prayers are very deep, so I'd like you to pray for us.' And I said, 'Sure, I will. I don't know if I can, I don't know if I can have that kind of authority,' right? But obviously the man believed in that authority. And he said, today, the man came in after davening and said, 'Wish me a mazel tov, Rebbe. My wife had a baby.' I said, 'Mazel tov.' He said, 'What can I do for you?' I said, 'Don't worry about it. You can't do anything for me. Go home.' That was the man. He came, he brought the food, he hugged me, I hugged him, right? So what's going on there, right? What's going on there is the Rebbe has charisma. He is, as a conduit of prayer, believed in by people, by his followers. And he effectuates things both for others and for himself in a kind of essentially modest and non-deterministic sort of way. And that's just an example of the character of Yaakov Yitzchak, the seer of Lublin. But the story I want to tell you that makes a distinction between a rabbi and a rebbe is this. Once there was a very poor man who came to the Rebbe of Lublin. He said, "Rebbe, I have a problem." "What's your problem?" says the Rebbe. The Rebbe says, "My problem is that my daughter is getting married and I'm too poor, I can't afford a dowry for her." The Rebbe says, "Oh, that's a big problem. How much do you need?" He says, "I need 200 rubles, which is a lot of money." The Rebbe says, "All right, I can get you the 200 rubles, but you have to do exactly what I say." And the man who has, you wanted to say faith, but Christians say faith. We say emunah, trust, which means the assurance that comes with having experience. St. Paul called faith the assurance of things unseen. Jews are like, Missouri, the show me state, right? The assurance of things seen, right? Because God did this for our ancestors, we trust in God. He has emunah, trust, and bitachon, assurance. So he says, "Okay, Rebbe, I'll do what you tell me." The Rebbe says, "Look, first go to the mikveh, get cleaned up, because to tell you the truth, you don't smell too well. You don't smell too good. And then take my Shabbos bekishim, my silk robe, and my shtreimel, my beautiful fur hat, and my clean white shirt, and my socks, and my shoes with the silver buckles, and go into Lublin where the famous fair, the horse fair, is being held. Go to the fanciest hotel in town and ask for the best room, and stay there till something happens." What can the man do? He does what the Rebbe has asked, and he walks into the hotel, fear and trembling. He goes up to the front desk, and the proprietor is there. He says, "I'd like your best room." "Certainly, sir," says the proprietor, thinking that this is a rich merchant dressed so beautifully. He says, "Till when will you need it?" He says, "For quite a while." Innkeeper is beside himself. He gives him the best room. And our hero sits in the room night after night in fear and trembling. He sees the numbers of the bills, multiplying before him. But what can a person do? You have to eat. So the second morning, maybe the third morning, he goes downstairs to the breakfast room and he sits down for breakfast. And there, sitting next to him at breakfast, is this lovely young man, this charming young man, who's a very nice conversationalist, very erudite, very fine. It turns out that he is the Malamed, the tutor for the innkeeper's children. And they become friends. And every day the man goes down, he reads the newspapers, he sits with the Malamed, they schmooze. Then he goes back up to his room. And for the rest of the day, he's sitting there in fear and trembling. And nothing is happening. After about a week, in the middle of the night, the door knocks. Door always knocks in a Hasidic story. So I need to have a Foley artist. You know what a Foley artist is, right? Somebody who makes the sounds like of horses and doors and meow, cats and creaking doors. Right? Mystery theater, right? So I have a Foley artist right here. Okay, let's do the knock again. Okay, the door knocks. He gets up in his pajamas, goes to the door, and there's the poor little Malamed. He's standing there in the hall in the cold in his pajamas. He says, come in, Yingo. What's going on? He says, oh, it's not good. I said, what happened? He said, look, I've been eating breakfast with you every morning. Now I really trust you. I have to tell you that a year ago, the innkeeper who was as rich as Croesus, was as rich as Minos, right? He won the lottery. Why him and not me? I don't know, but he won the lottery. He won 400 rubles, a lot of money. And I watched him. He got the cash, he put it in an envelope, and he stuck the envelope in, he has this little library here with books for the patrons of the hotel to read. He stuck it in this book. I saw which book he stuck it in, and he left. A day goes by, 2 days, a week, a month. 6 months into the whole thing, I realized he completely forgot that the money is there. So I went and I took the book off the shelf and I took the money out of the book. And I thought, oh, finally I can buy myself out of this job. 400 rubles, a lot of money. Could go back to my village. I'd be a rich man. So I put the money under my pillow and, what, says the man, what? He says, I couldn't spend it because I stole it. And I couldn't sleep because I had it. So every night I'm just miserable. I just don't know what to do. And I'm crying all night. And I haven't gotten a good night's sleep in 6 months. Oy, says the man, what can I do for you? He says, look, you're a rich man. You're staying in the nicest suite in the hotel. Just go tell the hotel owner that you found this money in the book when you took the book out of the bookshelf and you want to return it to him. Oh, he said the man, why didn't I figure that myself? Perfect. So he goes down the next morning and he does the deal. And the hotel owner is like ecstatic. He has 400 rubles he didn't know he had. He said, oh, this is amazing. I completely forgot about the money. Thank you. And you're so honest. I can't believe you give it to me. And the man says, well, between one rich man and another man, so the hotel proprietor says, all things being equal, we're both rich men. Let's split the money. I'll give you half, 200 rubles. And your stay in the hotel, it's on me. So now the man has solved the dowry problem, and he solved the stay in the hotel problem. And he goes straight back to the rebbe, the seer of Lublin, and he says, Rebbe, how can I? The rebbe says, no, you don't need to tell me. He says, no, but Rebbe, how can I? He says, you don't need to tell me. He says, Rebbe, how can I ever thank you? He doesn't tell him the story. He just says, how can I ever thank you? And the Rebbe, you, Kindra, you can see from one end of your nose to the other end if you're lucky and you're not wearing a mask, okay? But the Rebbe can see from one end of the world to the other end. And he says, thank you? I should thank you? You should thank me? You should thank me, he says, the Rebbe. The Rebbe says, I should thank you. I haven't slept for 6 months listening to the crying of that teacher. So the Rebbe sees all, and the Rebbe is attuned to the needs of humans, whether they're his followers or not. And the Rebbe's attunement comes, moreover, not from any Gemaras he learned, and not from knowing what happens if a chicken falls into a vat of milk. Can I drink the milk? Can I eat the chicken? Of course he should know those things, but that's not his focus. His focus is ecstatic prayer. His focus is meditation. His focus is connection with the divine. and his focus is intuitive sight and insight. And that's a leadership role that's very important. But more than that, you would think that a rebbe is somebody who's very much exalted because he has these talents and this charisma. Not at all. One of the things that marks many rebbes, and we'll eventually talk about different rebbes, is a true sense of humility, right? It's said of in the Gemara that Moses's light was like the light of the sun, and Joshua, his student's light, was the light of the moon. So the commentators go on, right? They say the light of the sun, the light of the moon. Obviously, the pshat, the simple meaning of that, is that Moshe had a lot to give personally, streaming out of him, and Joshua just reflected what Moses had to give. But Kalanimus Kalman Halevi Epstein was an important Kabbalist in the 17th century, no relation to me. He said as follows: yes, Moses' light was like the light of the sun, and Joshua's quote unquote only like the light of the moon, but you can look at the moon. You can look at the moon. I want to conclude with one story that happened to me personally. Years ago, my cousin, Sherwood Goffin, of blessed memory, was the chazan of Lincoln Square Synagogue in Manhattan and was the chazan for Rabbi Shlomo Riskin, who's now the chief rabbi of Efrat in Israel, and was my bar mitzvah rebbe. And so Sherwood, my cousin, was the court singer of the Bostoner Rebbe. Now, we talked about Chassidus being inflected, not infected. That's how you get COVID, by being infected, but by being inflected by its points of origin, right? So Boston Chassidus is a branch of Chernobyl Chassidus, Twersky family, etc., that ends up in Boston, as you may or may not know. And there are several Boston Rebbes, one in Israel, one in America, and there's already a Bostoner dynasty, and the Bostoner Rebbe is quite an amazing. This Bostoner Rebbe was quite an amazing guy, and I heard some wonderful stories about him. Like, I'll be quick, we have a few minutes. Like, he was once on a train, on an Amtrak train, going through Pennsylvania, and a little old lady sat across from him and asked him very politely, but in this sort of politely anti-Semitic way, why was it that the Orthodox, as she said, she didn't have the term ultra-Orthodox or Haredi or Hasidic, but why was it that the ultra-Orthodox or Orthodox Jews dressed like people in Poland 300 years ago, right? Why not modernize? And the Rebbe looked at her and bent close and said in a very sweet and polite way, he said, "But pardon me, madam, you mistake me. I'm Amish." He had no accent, right? No Yiddish accent. He said, "You mistake me, I'm Amish." And she said, "Oh, I'm sorry. No, I respect what you people do, right? Your adherence to tradition, right?" So that was the boss of the Rebbe. He was capable of making a joke at his own expense. So I was at a wedding of the Boston Rebbe's son with the daughter of the Mudgitzer Rebbe. It was a big wedding, and there were a lot of music, because both Boston and Mudgitz are courts that have a lot of music. And I had brought along my then 10-year-old son. And I approached the dais where the Rebbe was, and I said, I introduced myself. I said who I was and my family, and Sherwood Goffin and my Aunt Judy, Sherwood's mom, who was a Chassid of Boston for a long time. And not only did the Rebbe know who I was, but he could tell me who my father was. He knew the whole family. I won't even go into that. I'll tell you that story another time. And I said, I'd like you to give a bracha. I'd like you to give a blessing to my son. And he looked at me in this kind of arch way, like, I'm an American Rebbe. I don't do that. It's not, giving blessings, is not my thing. So he said, "Oh, come on. We traveled all the way. We came from New Haven, right? I really appreciate if he gave him blessing." So he looked at me, and he looked at Misha, who's now 37. He was 10 then. And he put his hand on his little head, and he said, May God cause you to help you to become a good Jew, observant of the Torah and commandments. May you do well in school and profit by your education. And may you be a credit to your parents and your grandparents. And then he turned his head to me and said, out of the side of his mouth, as assuredly you would have been without my blessing. As assuredly you would have been without my blessing. And in a way, that was a blessing for me, right? And a way of connecting with me and saying, you're going to raise great kids. You don't need a rebbe to give you magically great kids. So it was really a pleasure talking to you today. I see some comments in the chat, and usually I don't stay very long, but afterwards. But I have a couple of seconds today. I appreciate the expressions of enjoyment of what I've said, but a couple of things. The artists do fit into the prophetic strata, I agree, Rochelle. And healers, often the charismatic leaders that we're talking about, prophets were healers, as we read in last week's Haftorah. Even kings were healers, right? Certainly Rebbes are healers. Thank you for your kind words, all of you. And yes, my wife would love to come and talk for CSP. For some reason, Ari never got that bug in his ear, so you can put it there. I won't promote my wife. Jeff says, so the Rebbe is charismatic. What's to prevent a charismatic person from leading a community astray? And the answer is nothing. Nothing. So here's the thing. Charisma is very entertaining and interesting and compelling. But for my money, as someone who comes from, let's say, a Hasidic adjacent world, right, and is now in a wider world, for my money, give me a Maimonidean rationalist anytime over a Hasidic charismatic leader. I think it could be highly problematic. Some of my own teachers were problematic in that way, and I'm tortured perpetually about how much honor I give them and how much I say I can't value what they gave me. Can I value what they gave me if they were problematic in one way or another as leaders? So this is wonderful. Really, really, really thank you for being here. And I'm glad, Lynn, that you understand your beloved relatives in Muncie and B'nai Brak a little bit better. Sei gesund, and we will see you next week. And next week, we will be talking about God knows what. Let's see. Next week, it looks like, I just lost it. Next week's section is, Messiahs. So I promised you we'd talk about Mashiach. We'll talk about Messiahs and where that goes. It's often not in such a great place. Pleasure to see you and look forward. Sei gesund. Have a great week and a great Shabbos. Bye-bye.